The war between Russia and Ukraine is now entering its third year and there are no signs that it will end anytime soon. During the past time, in order to support President Zelensky's army, the West has continuously sent them huge amounts of aid in both money and weapons, but it seems that it is still not enough. Enough to defeat the Russians and regain lost territories. So perhaps it is time for the West to intervene militarily more strongly and directly in the Ukrainian situation. If they still want a government friendly to them to exist in Kiev, to prevent the influence of Russia to Western Europe, the question here is what the West, specifically NATO, will have to do and how to do it. More importantly, will those actions be effective? As expected or not? After 2 years it seems that the Russians are gradually gaining the upper hand and the recent victory at Avdiivka is a clear proof. We do not know how this will affect the outcome of the war. However, it can be certain that it will be difficult for Ukraine to retake lost territories before NATO becomes more deeply involved in the war. So what is Kiev lacking now and how can the North Atlantic Treaty Organization help? Any. Since the war broke out until now, the Russian Aerospace Force has still dominated the sky, despite the majority of forces being blocked from crossing the front line. However, only the front line campaigns, their efforts alone were enough to cause Ukraine to suffer heavy losses, not to mention airstrikes deep within its territory. Therefore, a very important thing that Kiev needs to do to maintain the war effort is to keep Russian fighter jets away from logistics activities and transporting weapons to the front. Let's simply say they need to shoot down as many as possible as soon as they approach the front line at a distance of several tens of kilometers. Although the idea sounds good, the limitations of the Air Force and the low number of high-altitude surveillance equipment mean that Ukraine has not been able to realize it. In addition, Kiev currently cannot really stand on equal footing. Even with the Russians on the ground using missiles and artillery as they did a year ago. Partly because of the lack of ammunition and artillery vehicles themselves, partly because the opponent has concentrated artillery to increase the effectiveness of these weapons. Bombardment, besides similar to the enemy's air force, Ukraine needs to suppress missile artillery and assault bullet units, also known as suicide UAVs, that are deploying power from far away from the front line. At the same time, we must continuously shell the Russian front line before launching the attack. Not only that, they must also neutralize the medium-sized drones that are on reconnaissance missions. Only when these are carried out can ground attacks by the Kiev army be possible. Carried out with high efficiency. One thing in common with all the problems just mentioned is that it is not easy for NATO to intervene to help Ukraine solve them for political and economic reasons. If NATO really supports Ukraine, its member states' organization will have to spend more money than they have spent so far. At the same time, there is a very sensitive and delicate cause that is political. In fact, we have seen signs that the West is afraid of direct collision with Moscow, such as sending weapons to Moscow for Kiev but does not allow their use to attack targets located on current Russian territory. The biggest political risk that NATO military intervention could cause is to raise tensions to the point of breaking out into a nuclear conflict. However, so far, NATO members have done nothing to make the general public. Russian President Vladimir Putin must let them know that the king is not joking and is ready to turn the threats into reality by unlocking the world's largest nuclear toy store. Therefore, NATO's gradual addition of forces and increased presence in Ukraine in indirect ways is considered extremely reasonable because this does not violate the red line outlined by Mr. Putin. So NATO can prevent it? Prevent the Russian Air Force from deploying power at the same time to dominate the sky to serve reconnaissance and air strikes. Up to now, most of the air defense systems transferred to Ukraine by the West were not taken from their active arsenals but instead were newly released systems. However, due to funding problems, limited allocation while having to increase production to meet Kiev's needs. So the number of air defense systems in aid was not as large as it could have been. Therefore, NATO had to send out systems from its old reserves, and despite their strength on the battlefield, Ukraine is still very desirable, but these numbers are usually not large. Therefore, a serious NATO effort to compete for control of the Ukrainian sky will certainly require the participation of anti-aircraft missile systems. No currently on staff to fight with you. The number mobilized must be much larger, and about 10 US Patriot batteries would be a good start. Until now, Washington has only transferred to Kiev a system of this type, and they will have to coordinate their operations with many other air defense missile batteries, some of which were donated by other countries while others were simply purchased new from the manufacturer. Besides, more money is sent to Kiev, which means the speed of production of new air defense systems is increased, and the training process for soldiers to use it is increased. They can be done quickly and almost certainly proficiently in just the time it takes to deliver the missiles to Ukraine. But ground-based radar and missile systems can't do everything right away. Even if NATO replaces damaged goods or lost them to Russia, the problem still exists, that is, a missile cannot shoot what it cannot see. And an aircraft operating at low altitude about 90 meters above the ground will only be detected at a range of nearly 50 kilometers. Meanwhile, the radar itself cannot be placed right on the front line, it must be deep within Ukrainian territory, if you do not want to be counted on the count by the enemy's rocket artillery or suicide UAVs. So no matter how good the air defenses that NATO transfers to Kiev are, they are still unlikely to prevent the Russian Air Force from deploying power to the front lines. That is why NATO needs to focus on its fighter force. Currently, Ukraine is ready to receive several dozen F-16 Fighting Falcons in 2024. And this is the maximum number that the country's Air Force can operate right away. The reason is because they are lacking pilots, while training pilots from scratch to get used to a completely new fighter jet and operate effectively in just 1 year is completely impossible. Therefore, if NATO really serious about the idea of an air war in Ukraine, they will have to increase their aircraft force in both quantity and quality instead of transferring to Kiev old F-16 variants with technology from the end of the century before. NATO needs to release the newest and best products of this line, the F-16 Viper, and most of the weight will fall on the shoulders of none other than the United States, the big brother of the organization and also the country that gave birth to the F-16. According to unconfirmed sources, each year this country is capable of manufacturing new and modernizing about 50 F-16s. At this rate, that is expected to continue to increase. In just 1 to 2 years most of the country's F-16s will continue to grow. The U.S. Air Force will be upgraded to V standard. However, just a few hundred F-16s is not enough. NATO will want to transfer fifth-generation fighters like the F-35 Lightning II to Ukraine, and indeed they is considering doing so. In that case, the F-35 Lightning II will hold 3 types of fighter aircraft, including the old F-16 upgraded version and the F-35, thereby deploying them for different missions. Specifically, the old F-16 will carry long-range weapons to project power to the front, while avoiding falling into danger. Meanwhile, the modernized F-16 will support the F-35 in direct combat on the front lines and perform missions with higher risks such as destroying infrastructure, air defense systems or intercepting aircraft. Russia, besides, it is estimated that Kiev will need at least 500 fighter jets for the plan to dominate the sky to be effective. This number may sound like a lot, but for a country with an area of more than 600,000 square kilometers like Ukraine, it's really not like that. Considering that maintaining the air patrol mission alone requires 150 F-16s operating together. And when taking into account the losses that did not come from air combat as well as from Russian attacks on Ukrainian bases, Kiev almost had to exhaust the capabilities of its 500 aircraft force to gain control of the sky. In fact, the ideal number of aircraft is as many as possible, even 1,000 or 2,000 aircraft. It may also be the number Ukraine wants, but as mentioned, in order to avoid tensions rising to the level of nuclear conflict, NATO can currently only approach indirectly, and in this way it is difficult to find enough volunteer crews. And placing more aircraft in Ukraine is too difficult. Not to mention the large force as well as the Russian Air Force's ability to favor air combat more than ground attacks, which will force NATO to maintain a large force just to drive them out of Ukrainian airspace. Theoretically, this is completely possible. If political factors allow, NATO fighters will have to transfer to Kiev a lot of accompanying weapons and promise to spend a large amount of money. Not small in their inventory, such as anti-radiation missiles AGM-88 for F-35 and HARM for F-16. There are also thousands of cruise missiles, tens of thousands of precision-guided bombs SDB and Stormbreaker. Besides, there is a high possibility that NATO will significantly increase its capacity to make JDAMER bombs to send to Ukraine. However, the important thing is that they need to supplement Kiev with reconnaissance and surveillance platforms. Of course, modern radars on aircraft can be used. Donate. For example, the Dragon I and DB-10 on the F-16 can be used to acquire images from long distances. However, the needs of modern battlefields are not enough, and that is why Ukraine needs precision drones such as the Bayraktar TB2, thanks to its large size with a length of 6.5 m, wingspan is 12 m with take-off load of 700 kilograms, it can carry many devices to enhance tracking capabilities at long distances without having to put yourself in danger. At the same time, the possibility of NATO is deploying a WACS airborne early warning and command aircraft to cover an area hundreds of kilometers wide. In addition, the United States may also use modern unmanned aircraft models such as the Reaper or RQ-180 to support Kiev. So here NATO is facing a rather difficult political problem to date. In general, although the fighter aircraft that Ukraine operates are sometimes maintained, repaired, and upgraded abroad, most of them are located at domestic bases, ready to fight from those positions, such as bear the risk of damage caused by Russian troops. Therefore, if NATO wants the fighter jets sent as aid to return intact, one option that can be considered is for them to take off from the territories of member countries. Of course, the planes are delivered. Rapid response readiness missions will still have to be stationed in Ukraine. Because otherwise there simply wouldn't be time for timely implementation. Even NATO could create a more cautious fighting process, whereby expensive, advanced aircraft like the F-35 would be stationed outside Ukraine and, when needed, fly to an intermediate point inside country to carry out the mission. However, this will certainly be seen as an act of escalation in the eyes of the Russians, and they will of course try to shoot down as many planes as possible. Despite this reaction, Moscow's will only stop at that level and NATO bases will still be safe. On the contrary, this organization's fighters do not attack bases on Russian soil, and they can be satisfied with attacking targets on Ukrainian territory, such as ground combat vehicles, military aircraft, or missiles. Cruise fire. There is also another problem that NATO needs to solve if it wants to help Kiev master the sky. More aircraft in combat means more non-Ukrainian military personnel, including pilots and support staff. As mentioned, Kiev lacks a large number of personnel capable of operating modern aircraft. This will most likely anger the Russians, and to circumvent the law, NATO soldiers appearing in Ukraine must fight as mercenaries for Kiev. However, because most of Mr. Zelensky's government's budget is currently funded by the West, NATO soldiers are basically still paid by NATO. It sounds promiscuous, but the payment method and relationship follow. This type of indirectness will help avoid escalating the conflict. Of course, in a modern war, air power alone is not enough to create the necessary destruction. The cost of fighter jets is too expensive, and they are not available for use in large enough numbers. So Ukraine will need more NATO volunteers or mercenaries to help operate ground combat systems, although it may not have a full tank crew or artillery or missile battery, composed entirely of foreign fighters, but only one experienced team member was able to help his Ukrainian comrades fight more effectively. At the same time, a veteran soldier would be able to provide maintenance support. Vehicles between each combat deployment help increase the life of weapons, something Kiev desperately needs when aid packages are showing signs of decreasing. Not only that, to fight against the abundant firepower coming from energy. Strong defense production combined with support from friendly Russian countries, NATO will have to say goodbye to many of its artillery and missile reserves. In addition, weapons such as the ATACMS tactical ballistic missile system, and even the completely new precision attack name PRSM needs to be used liberally instead of sparingly. Besides, given the fact that Ukrainian artillery is being seriously weakened by Russia, it is likely that NATO will need to send about 1,000 more M109 cannons and many types of artillery to Kiev. Why M109? Simply because it is not the best system, but it is a popular Western artillery model and can send in large numbers very quickly. At the same time, they will be operated by batteries of mainly Ukrainian military personnel with the support of NATO volunteers or mercenaries using former NATO soldiers for missions that rarely have to appear directly on the battlefield. They will suffer much fewer casualties. And this is an extremely important thing, mainly related to political issues. If there are US and EU citizens killed in war. English, domestic public opinion will be less upset if it is volunteers and they bring in a lot of money. At the same time, it will be difficult for the Russian side to determine or have an excuse to complain about the number of Western soldiers operating in Ukraine. In return, NATO will have to pay a literally high price. The reason is because some volunteers or mercenaries, especially highly specialized ones such as fighter pilots, can demand very high salaries, up to millions of dollars a year. And that is also the only way to convince soldiers to give up promising careers in NATO to switch to being anonymous mercenaries in the airspace. In addition, Ukraine cannot wage war effectively without attacking Russian logistics bases, warehouses, and factories, not only in Crimea. In fact, they tried to do so, but the country had too few weapons to carry out a large-scale and sustained campaign. Although NATO can still maintain its policy of indirect engagement by not deploying its missiles against targets inside Russia, it will have to do something to facilitate Kiev. Basically, cheap cruise missiles or suicide drones would be suitable options. NATO can produce parts and components in large quantities, then bring them to Ukraine to assemble the finished products, so that Kiev will automatically own weapons with the Made in Ukraine logo of Western quality and comfort. The roof is used, while NATO is not accused of causing stress. But in the end, with all the additional reconnaissance capabilities or powerful firepower, the people who have to sweat and shed tears directly facing dangers outside of recruitment are still Ukrainian soldiers. Even though they are having problems with human resources, but this is a problem that TN can solve. In a press conference at the end of 2023, President Zelensky said that the Ukrainian army needs to mobilize 500,000 more soldiers, so this will cost about 12 billion euros. With that, considering that 6 Ukrainian civilians are needed to raise 1 soldier, this country will have to have 3 million more workers to pay salaries for additional troops. According to some experts, the solution to this problem may be for Western countries to completely take over the financial economy. Ukraine's main government, send more food, supplies, and money, so fewer Ukrainians will need to work to maintain the army, leading to more people willing to fight. So this will be a costly effort, but if you compare it with the amount of money the West has poured into wars in the past, it is far from equal. More importantly, this Thai move aims at the further goal of building up forces slowly and surely and eventually exhausting the Russians. Honestly speaking, the situation is extremely sensitive and this is the method. The only feasible solution, because any rapid and sudden escalation of tensions could lead to the use of nuclear weapons. On the contrary, if Russia faces gradual changes on the front that are carried out over a long period of time, for example, several years, it will be difficult for them to find an excuse to turn their threats into reality. What if NATO openly sends hundreds of thousands of its troops to Ukraine? It's not difficult to confirm that this is certainly a lot more elite soldiers than the people Mr. Zelensky has, and they will help bring a little progress set on the battlefield. The biggest difference is that instead of preparing gradually over many years, an all-out attack by the North Atlantic Organization would only need half a year to be ready to launch. Of course, the downside of such military operations is that the nuclear threat is more evident than ever, Domestic public opinion is angry because it cannot accept hundreds of thousands of lives being lost in a short time and the arsenal being almost empty after a campaign. That is why it is unlikely to happen instead. Therefore, attacking indirectly and saving resources to deal with opponents who are sitting still and waiting for the opportunity to disrupt the situation, like China, for example, will be a much wiser choice. Just now there are military knowledge analyses of ways that NATO can use to intervene more deeply in the war in Ukraine and help Kiev's army fight against the Russians. According to you and your friends, how will they act in the near future? How effective will it be, and what will Moscow do on the other side of the front line to cope with the Second World War? Can 3 take place or not? Please don't hesitate to leave your opinion below in the comments section, and thank you.